But the doctors who hear the story, and certainly my doctors to this day, have no idea how I came back. I have no idea how I came back, and yet I can tell you that there's some lessons in there that are beautiful lessons for all of us, because the power is there for all of us to awaken as eternal spiritual beings and come to realize much more what this is all about. And the beautiful gift that brings with it is a tremendous capability for healing in every sense of the word. Now, I'm pretty much a child of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And like many in this room who are of my generation, I grew up knowing that science is the pathway to truth. Now, I'm more of a scientist now than I've ever been. And I also realize that the science that I worshiped before my coma, and I promise you that that pure materialist science, reductive materialism, that in a nutshell says if you reduce everything down to electrons, protons, quarks, neutrons, photons, subatomic particles, build up the physics, chemistry, biology, the brain, and all of that, you can understand everything there is to understand about the workings of the universe. This is all about a far deeper understanding of who we are and a great gift to science. This is all about science and spirituality converging. They're far more powerful together. Now, I want to take you back 5.5 years or so, at which time I had spent more than 20 years in academic neurosurgery, thought I had some idea of how the brain, mind, and consciousness worked. The morning of November 10th, 2008, at 4:30, I woke up with severe back pain. This was totally out of the blue. And this, of course, is a lot of the story proof of heaven, but I don't want to repeat a lot of that, but there are a few essential parts that I want to bring out. And I remember thinking that if I could make it down the hallway in my home and get into a hot bath, maybe the pain would go away. Well, in fact, I got into a hot bath and almost couldn't get out of the tub. The pain kept getting worse and worse. I was able to pull myself up on a towel and then took little baby steps down the hall back into the bedroom, and I collapsed, writhing in agony, in a cold sweat. Collapsed on the bed and just in abject misery, couldn't figure out what in the world was going on, the pain getting worse and worse by the minute. Soon thereafter, my youngest son, at that time he was 10 years old, his name is Bond. Those who've read the book will realize that Bond is a far more appropriate name for him than I knew at the time. But Bond came in the room and realized Dad's not off at work, and my God, he looks like he's in horrible pain. So he came over and he started rubbing my temples to make me feel better. As soon as he touched my head, I felt like he'd driven a white-hot railroad spike right through my head. Severe pain. And of course, anyone out there with any kind of medical background, if you heard about sudden onset of severe back pain, severe headache, you might think meningitis. Well, the doctor was already out. My brain was being overrun with an extremely rare, aggressive, primitive, and absolutely should have killed me bacterial infection, a meningoencephalitis. And I had no clue what was unfolding. I was gone from this world for the next 7 days. Don't remember a thing. My family actually thought I was resting, so they closed the door and let that happen. And about 2 hours later, when they came in to check on me, I was having a grand mal epileptic seizure. Now, when I did come back, my brain was wrecked. No words, no language, no recognition of any of those beings around the hospital bed. My mother, sisters, sons. Absolutely no clue what this universe was. But I knew where I'd been. I remembered completely, full well, the journey I was returning from. Even though I remembered absolutely nothing during any part of it, of Eben Alexander's life before coma. No words, no language, none of the religious concepts, certainly none of the knowledge of all those years spent in neurosurgery studying brain, mind, and consciousness. Every bit of that was completely deleted for this entire experience, which makes it a little bit atypical when you look at other near-death experiences. But I was amnesic for the life of Eben Alexander, and it took me many months to even begin to glimpse how and why that might have been the case. My default understanding early on was that, well, of course, I had this severe bacterial meningitis that destroyed the neocortex, the human part of my brain. So it made perfect sense that I didn't have any memories or knowing of my life before coma. Turns out the reasons for it go quite a bit deeper than that. But that was my working model for a long time, that such a severe neocortical destruction would erase all the memories. But it turns out that that set the stage for a very powerful journey with tremendous lessons in it. Now, what I knew full well when I came back was the entire journey. That journey started in a place that I call the earthworm's eye view. Very primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm, like being underground or in dirty jello. I remember this sensation of lots of roots or blood vessels around me. And almost I can feel them just thinking about what it was like, and I could sense them way off into the distance. Although I had no body image at any point of this journey. I was just a piece of awareness experiencing all this. But in that coarse, horrible, ugly underground realm that was completely unresponsive, even though I had no words, no language, I could still wonder, what, where? But never a flicker of response to that curiosity. Now, many, when I would give these talks early on, they would say, well, was that earthworm's eye view, which is what I call that ugly underground realm where everything began, was that hell or purgatory? I would think hell would be at least a little bit interactive. And this was none of that. That curiosity was never answered with any flicker of anything. In looking back on it, I think that that very coarse, primitive, murky existence was the very best consciousness my physical brain could muster when it was soaking in pus and being destroyed by this primitive E. coli infection. Now, and it did seem that that earthworm eye view went on for eons, because I promise you I had no memory moment to moment of time. I had absolutely zero memory of my life before coma, not a tiniest bit. And so it did seem to go on for a very long time. The good news, it did not last forever. And what happened next was this slowly spinning white light that came towards me, a very clear and pure light that had fine white and gold tendrils off of it. And this white light came towards me, and the best part about it is it came packaged with a perfect musical melody. And it turns out that I had been aware of sound in that earthworm eye view, that very primitive existence. The sound was a pounding, monotonous sound, like someone smashing on an anvil over and over again. Just a steady rhythm. And it was a very cursing sound. And yet, as this pure white light came towards me, it was coming with this perfect musical melody. Absolutely beautiful. And as you will hear, sound, music, vibration, frequency is the way that our souls transcend in these levels. It's one of the reasons why sound, hymns, chants have been used for thousands of years to help engender deep transcendental conscious states in any kind of spiritual broadening of consciousness, religious ceremony, etc. And that sound is absolutely essential to the work I do now. That melody, spinning melody as I called it, came towards me, and it opened up like a rip in that ugly earthworm eye view, and it was a rip that opened up into this brilliant, ultra-real valley. And I remember ascending up into this valley, up into this brilliant greenery, lush with life, absolutely fertile. And I had no body awareness, but I was moving up through it because I was a speck on a butterfly wing for Eben Alexander's life before coma as I went through all this. And that part is quite atypical for a near-death experience. And of course, I originally attributed that to the severe meningitis, destruction of my neocortex. To me, that explained why I didn't remember my life. I know now the explanation goes far deeper than that. But it turns out that months after my coma, I was really wrestling with things as I read more and more near-death experiences. One is, if I had scripted this, first and foremost, my father would have been there. He had passed over 4 years before my coma. This is the father I mentioned to you earlier, combat surgeon in the Second World War, who was a tremendous influence on me, a scientist, and a very strong religious and spiritual influence. and yet he was nowhere to be found. And similarly, in my view, as I read more and more of this, was the deep mystery on that butterfly wing, that beautiful girl. I'll never forget how she was dressed, how she was sitting, how she looked at me, the way her thoughts came in. You're deeply loved and cherished, all those wonderful messages of unconditional love. I remember her face so perfectly that when I came back, I realized I'd never met her in my life. That was a really deep mystery. And to me, the more I read about near-death experiences, the more I realized how the similarities far outweigh the differences. How my experience very much validated tens of thousands of reports out there of other near-death experiences and of the afterlife literature and of prophets and mystics in their writings going back thousands of years. And yet, who in the world was this beautiful girl? And I was really shocked because I knew I'd been on a profound, very real spiritual journey. My birth mother was a sophomore in high school. My birth father was a senior in high school. And there was really no way for them to get together. And as my birth mother found out to her chagrin over several months, as much as she wanted to keep me, the handwriting was on the wall. So she had to let me go. Now it turns out that like many adoptees, I would wonder about my birth family, and I would sometimes write letters to the children's home as I was growing up, wondering, is there any sign of my birth mother out there? And those strict North Carolina laws were there to prevent any kind of reunion. In fact, I heard of examples where birth dates were changed just to make it more difficult for anyone to find their origins. That was that trauma I told you about in February 2000 that sent me into 8 years of pure agnosticism. I didn't recognize what a hit that perceived rejection was at that time. It was only months later when people started pointing out to me that I'd stopped taking my 2 sons to church. I stopped saying prayers with them at night. And I came to realize that the biggest casualty of that perceived rejection was it wiped out any last hope that there was a loving personal God or any power to prayer. And that was gone from my life for 8 years. I promise you my coma journey changed all of that forever. Well, it turns out that 7 years after that, in the summer of 2007, walking on a beach in South Carolina with 2 of my sisters, they said, well, don't you think it's about time you reached out to your birth family again?